Welcome to the Psychosocial Safety Summit coming to you in Brisbane in October 2024. This year, I wanted to do things differently and introduce you to the speakers and supporters in the lead up to the event because you need to get to know these incredible people before you arrive. And if you haven't got your ticket yet, jump on the link below. Now, today you're in for a treat because I'd love to introduce you to Kanae Dyas, who is the Workplace Support Unit Manager for Anglo American, and she also sits on several groups for the Minerals Council of Australia and the Queensland Resources Council, providing advice on psychosocial hazards and respect at work. Kanae was also the winner of the 2023 Women in Mining and Resources Queensland Inclusion and Diversity Excellence Program and Champion Award. Kanae, it is so wonderful to have you here, and thank you so much for being a part of the summit.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm so delighted and really excited to be a part of the Psychosocial Summit and be amongst so many other fantastic cohorts in the industry as well. So thank you for inviting me.
You are welcome. And I'd love for you to share with us a little bit about your background and experience, because as I just kind of shared, you are involved in a lot and your history and wisdom is going to come through in your talk. So I would love for people to find out a little bit more about you.
Sure. Thanks so much. Well, I've been working in mining for, I'd say, mining and manufacturing for about 25 years plus. But prior to that, interestingly enough, I started out in finance and also military. So, working in male-dominated industries for quite some time and having to navigate those spaces were particularly challenging through the early years around the 80s and 90s to where we are now. And a lot of the work that I've done has come through my own lived experiences, particularly working in those fields, but also working in areas of health and safety and HR, and particularly mental health and wellbeing have been the driving factors in those areas. And it was fascinating because my family works in health and health and wellbeing, as well as a background in mining. So it just seemed to be a very natural progression for me to work into that field. And it was interesting because I was working in the US at the time in HR and managing a lot of different programs, particularly around I&D and injury management and workplace rehabilitation programs, particularly from offenders through to workplaces. So it was a really broad depth of experience and oversight in terms of working with culturally and racially marginalised people at risk. To where we are now. And that links into a lot of the I&D work that I do, particularly around cultural safety and psychological safety when we're working with demographics at risks, whether it's women, LGBTIQA+, all the way through to First Nations and people with disability. And how does that all fit in with psychosocial management? Yeah, a lot, particularly when we're talking about intersectional factors and demographics at risk and how we manage psychosocial hazards. So for me, when I came into mining, it was my background's in occupational health, hygiene, safety, and then it progressed into wellbeing and performance. And with that was research programs that started off the back of the WA inquiry into suicide rates with FIFO workers. And I was very fortunate to represent Rio Tinto as part of that research program. And they were really only looking at non-work related issues at the time in terms of biopsychosocial factors, not really the psychosocial factors. And that was back around 2013, 2014. And with that body of work, it went on then to become Mates in Mining, as we know now, which is a fantastic program and doing some incredible work around early intervention and prevention. And with that work, I was involved in many things around biomathematical modelling to all sorts of things around fitness for work. But my passion really lay in the psychological health and safety space. And I could really see the impacts in terms of what an unsafe workplace looked like, and not just from our physical hazards and risks that we face, things like working at heights, vehicles and driving. But there was a real gap in terms of understanding psychological injuries and supporting individuals and really understanding what the causal factors were and putting in effective controls. And quite often it was around behavioural-based psychosocial hazards. And there was a real disconnect between health and safety and HR So for me, it was something that seemed to be more of an organic progression. I just felt that there was some kind of pull and a gap in that space where I started working on psychosocial hazards even before it was a known thing or we had a name for it or before even legislation. I just saw that there was work that needed to be done. So I was fortunate to work for Rio Tinto and develop a psychosocial program and mental health and suicide prevention program there, as well as be involved in DV and work also in terms of IND. And this is where I specifically saw demographics at risk around psychological injuries that were more exposed to, say, discrimination, bullying, sexual harassment, and had challenges in terms of organisational justice and procedural fairness, which in itself was another causal factor in some of these things. I've been heavily involved, you know, in the historical sense of health and safety, but it evolved more into the space of psychological health and safety and wanting to create a more safe and inclusive space for all people, and certainly women in the industry because of the types of risks that we're exposed to, the prevalency, the severity of those risks. And we seem to be lost in that space. So it was really important to have someone advocating that and driving that and ensuring that the industry, when we talk about risk-based approaches with psychosocial hazards, what does that actually mean? It's not just taking the WHS risk management model. It's actually understanding, you know, who are your demographics at risk? And do we have a solid understanding of what mitigation measures we need to put in? And how do we actually manage that risk in a way that's psychologically and culturally safe, where we're not exposing them to further harm? So hence where this body of work I've taken with psychosocial management to have more of an IND component with trauma-informed care to ensure that our systems, symbols, behaviours are safe and that they're inclusive and representative of the diverse range of people that work in our industry. So I do a lot of that work. I do mentoring. I'm still involved in suicide prevention. I work in community with culturally and racially marginalised people all the way through to working at our operational mines, open cut underground. So I've spent a lot of time doing out in the field myself. And now I run this program at Anglo American, which I love. It's a lot of hard work, but I absolutely love it.
So just leading on from that, what is your role there and what do you do?
Yeah, it's the workplace support program. So it was fascinating because I had constructed elements of this at Rio Tinto, but I never actually saw it as a workplace support program, but I was already innately doing those things, if that makes sense. And perhaps in different programs through health and wellbeing programs that we were running all the way through to IND, but there all seemed to be a common theme that linked it, if that makes sense. And it was around the support and advocacy and prevention piece and early intervention that I saw with all of these things. And there was a disconnect in wanting to bring that together. So when I secured a role with Incitec Pivot Limited and Dyno Nobel, I thought how progressive of them. They had actually created a role. Even I was about 5 or 6 years ago now for a workplace support manager as such and mental health and wellbeing specialist. And that really excited me. And it was a green role. I could go in and create something. So essentially, I went in and identified those gaps and I developed a very similar program of what I've done here, but we've perfected it at Anglo, if that makes sense. So particularly off the back of the Elizabeth Broderick report and the WA inquiry into sexual harassment in the resources sector. So the program is a combination of all the things that I've done throughout my career. And so it's a holistic program based on cultural and psychological safety to manage complex psychosocial hazards. And that includes bullying, sexual harassment, discrimination, and obviously non-psychosocial hazards such as domestic violence as well. So there's several components to the program. So the program in itself, we have education and awareness that is mandatory from the time of onboarding through to times of induction at our sites with all of our workers and our contractor workforce. So we ensure that the messages are aligned and we're building the capability from the first time that they have experience with Anglo-American. We've set the behaviours, and that's built on care, respect and safety. So it's really important. And giving them the tools to be able to understand what that actually looks like and how do we intervene when these instances occur, and what are the processes and the impacts, importantly, that these behaviours can have. So the program is built on the education and training. We have a very comprehensive defined model of training to include leader psychosocial training all the way through to our critical stakeholders, such as health and safety and HR, and our frontline leaders, who need a solid understanding in terms of the risk management, the impacts and the legislative requirements around that. The other components to this is we've built a risk management model and a framework. Obviously, that's consistent to the code of practice to ensure that we're meeting those requirements in terms of assessing and managing those risks. So that's a large part of that in terms of making sure that we have the right processes in place, particularly from quality and assurance. So there's a technical governance and risk management component to the program. In addition to building capability. The other component to the program is reporting and analytics. So what I've built in and what we seem to have inconsistent across the industry is this reporting piece, and we understand why, like mental health. These incidents are quite often underreported because of low psychological safety and fear of reprisal or victimisation. So for us, that's where the workplace support unit came in, the trauma-informed workplace support unit, where we could grab this de-identified data to give us the solid information that we really needed in terms of strategic drivers to ensure that we were building the relevant controls and effective controls. So the workplace support unit is a trauma-informed service in-house, very similar to an EAP, but not, if that makes sense. We act as a conduit also between leaders and HR and health and safety, guiding them through the process in terms and investigations to ensure that the processes that they're undertaking when they're either conducting an investigation or responding to an incident doesn't actually expose the individual to further harm and exacerbate a psychological injury, particularly when there could be trauma or PTSD involved. So we have a trauma-informed care model where it's based on early intervention, prevention, support and recovery, end-to-end. So that involves sometimes return to work, all the way through to coaching, mediation, and obviously and suicide intervention and prevention as well. We also work by way of education building and capability building, particularly when there's other things around gender safety and gender health reproductive issues, particularly around menopause, or some health concerns that women might have, but they're unsupported in a regional area. And if they're working in a male-dominated environment, they may feel very uncomfortable to raise. And sometimes these health concerns can be mishandled. So we step in and provide support around those I&D factors, as well as supporting our Indigenous programs from a cultural safety to mitigate harm. So we wear a lot of hats in this role, and it's kind of grown organically, but essentially we are there to support the workforce in all areas of psychosocial hazard management to prevent psychological harm and to ensure that we're building the capability of our organisation and our leaders to ensure that we're compliant, but importantly to make sure that we're operating with care and respect for our workforce, and they have some form of internal support as opposed to being farmed out to, say, an EAP, where that experience can sometimes be really impersonal for them.
Yeah. And just wow, that is incredible. And it's hard to imagine that you do all of that with a team of two, because
Yes.
you have a small team. But the world needs more of you, and the workplaces need more of you. So I am so excited for organizations and individuals to come and learn from what you've done, because your background and history is just incredible. And I honestly don't know how you're going to answer the next question. Because you do wear so many hats, and you've been involved and are involved in so many major projects. But what's the most impactful project you're working on at the moment, and why?
Yeah, you're right. That is a hard question, because I I always say we talk about this work-life balance, and I say yes, absolutely. And as in a previous life as an occupational health and wellbeing specialist, I talk about all of these things, but then I find that I usually overextend myself because I love being involved in all of these projects, and they're important to me, and I'm very fortunate now that I'm in a position where my children are adults now, and I'm able to actually fill my cup with my time in being able to do these types of projects. But the things that are particularly important for me right now are the things that we're seeing around risk and what's actually causing a great deal of harm to our people. Regardless of what industry you're in, this seems to be really consistent across the board. And I'm always looking ahead in terms of emerging risk factors to make sure that we're across the board. And quite often we know dealing with psychosocial hazards, they can be hidden, they can be causal, integrated. But the things that I'm really seeing and have been overlooked is when we talk about intersectional factors, particularly for at-risk people. So when we're in an environment that inclusion and diversity is absolutely critical, and we understand why the benefits are there, particularly that drives innovations, improves business performance, and to tap into the richly diverse talent of a diverse people just makes sense, right? And we see it in terms of business performance. But with that, though, there is a lack of understanding, and there's also additional risks in terms of, well, when we're engaging with demographics at risk, do we have systems in place and cultural capability, and have we set them up for success in terms of how they interact out in our regional communities? Will they be exposed to greater harm? How do we actually respond to them? What are we doing in this space to ensure that we have systems and processes that are culturally safe for LGBTIQIA plus members, or someone that is First Nations or culturally and racially marginalised or neurodiverse? And we're seeing more women in our age groups and adults being diagnosed or as neurodiverse. And as women and people, you know, there's several layers in terms of intersectionality. And that means, you know, I'm a woman, I might be a woman of colour, such as myself from Papua New Guinea. I might also identify, you know, within the LGBTIQA community, or I might actually have identify as neurodiverse. Now, we've got to understand that with that, we need to demonstrate care and respect and safety. And the way that we've historically worked in the workplace, or the way that we've managed things in the workplace, hasn't necessarily worked or been safe for others. And so it's really important for me now that when we're managing psychosocial hazards and we're working for an increasingly diverse workforce, we need to ensure that we have the courage to dismantle the old ways of thinking and learning what we've learned, and that's hard. And really looking to adopt a new methodology in terms of a more holistic and integrated approach when we're working with a diverse workforce that is not going to be more harmful, so to speak. So this piece around intersectionality and trauma-informed care is a piece that is super important for me, particularly around bullying, where we know occupational suicide and PTSD and complex mental health disorders are associated to because of these types of harmful psychosocial hazards in the workplace. And we know that demographics at risk or a marginalised workforce are exposed to greater risks of bullying, discrimination and harassment. So that's where I'm focused. I'm still doing all of this other work, but in terms of a risk-based approach, that's what I'm seeing. This is what the data is presenting in the workplace. So we need to make sure that we are, doing the best that we can to reduce that risk.
Yeah. And I know that you've covered a little bit on what you're talking about at the summit as well. Did you just want to provide a little bit of a teaser into what else you're talking about? Yeah.
Yes. It's fascinating because psychosocial hazards, and I think you might agree, Nicole, where we started in this space, it's kind of grown. So even though we have these 14 psychosocial hazards that are universally recognized, which is great, we also know that there's other hazards in the background, the hidden hazards that aren't necessarily being talked about, or they're starting to reveal themselves now as, oh my goodness, they could be causal factors or several contributing factors as such. So I'll be talking about some of those hazards, the emerging areas that we need to look at, where psychosocial hazards are going in terms of evolving and how we need to build that capability, particularly around trauma-informed care when we're managing psychosocial hazards, and particularly a diverse workforce or our workforce at risk. And the key areas for me, again, I may have touched on that before, is really understanding why that trauma-informed care is absolutely critical in all aspects of psychosocial management, because we're not only dealing with psychosocial hazards, if we're talking about a whole person approach, we're talking about psychosocial factors. So we have to be really mindful of how we engage with individuals and understand how we do this in the most effective way and the safest way.
Yeah. And I cannot think of a better person to talk about this. So I'm so excited to see you at the summit. But for people who can't wait until then, what is the best way for them to connect with you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. Kanae, I know it's not an easy name to spell, but they might. Kanae Dyas. So have a look on LinkedIn and my contact details are there. I encourage people to reach out. Happy to share my experiences and knowledge, and it goes both ways. I always love to connect. So don't be shy. Feel free to reach out, and always happy to connect as well.
Fantastic. And once again, thank you so much, Kanae, for being a part of the summit and for everything that you do. And I cannot wait to meet you in person in October.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Nicole. Look forward to seeing you then.
You too.